Hey everyone, I'm Jack Fossett, and today we are going to look at the Fender Super Reverb Tone Master. This is a digital amp that is aiming to recreate to a T the sound and features of the famous Fender Super Reverb amp, but also going beyond. It's a holy grail of all amps and has been one of my personal favorites for a very long time. So we're going to dive in, play a lot of different tones today, talk about the features, show you some of the different features, and also talk about whether or not this is an amp that you should be looking at. So let's get started with some tone. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Follow the links below where you can listen to some music, and I hope you enjoy. So many of you have been waiting on this one for a while. The Tone Master series has been out for a few years now, and of course it started with the Deluxe Reverb and the Twin Reverb, and they've gotten really great responses. So of course the Super was something that a lot of people were excited about. So we're going to talk about the features right now and go through a couple of different tones, and then I'm going to tell you kind of my thoughts towards the end. For starters, this is very dedicated recreation of the Super Reverb when it comes to tone, when it comes to setup. It's in a lightweight cabinet. It actually has the same 4 speakers as the Super Reverb 65 reissue, which is the Jensen P10R. That's a great speaker, and so that was actually one of my first indications of like, all right, so this is a serious amp. This is not a cheap modeling amp by any stretch of the imagination. The control panel features look exactly like a Super Reverb and behave exactly like a Super Reverb. You've got your normal channel, you've got your vibrato channel, which has the reverb and the tremolo. The reverb and the tremolo are foot switchable. It actually comes with a different foot switch. It's not the classic chrome dome foot switch. It's a more modern foot switch, which works in one serious way, which is that you have LEDs. So I actually like that, especially because sometimes I use these effects subtly, and if you don't have the LEDs, believe it or not, sometimes on stage settings you can kind of, geez, is that on or not? You've got your bright switches. Everything just looks exactly the same. If you look at it, it looks exactly the same except for the little Tone Master badge, which is down on the lower right if you're looking at it on the front. Where it's different is in the back. Now you have a power switch. You also have a mute switch instead of a standby switch. Now this is really interesting, and this is where it starts to get kind of unique, and it starts to get to be something that's really special. This has an output power selector, and it's a little bit different than what it says it is, which I'll describe in a minute. But essentially it's like an attenuation, right? So you have settings for 0.5 watts, 1 watt, 5 watts, 12 watts, 22 watts, and 45 watts, which is the full sound. Here's where it's deceptive. It's none of those wattages. The reason being is because this is a solid state digital amplifier, and solid state watts do not equate to tube watts when it comes to volume. This is actually running off of a 200 watt power amp, so it's very, very powerful. The reason that it has those is because that's kind of like the volume equivalency, again, of the Super Reverb, like the regular tube one. So 45 watts would be volume-wise equivalent to what the regular tube Super Reverb would be. And then backing off like this is kind of a way of simplifying it, even though it's not actually running at those wattages. That is something that makes it really, really special, because one of the big complaints about the Super Reverb is that it's loud. Now, it sounds beautiful at lower volumes. It's one of the best clean amps you'll ever hear in your life. The reason that that becomes an issue is because a lot of people want a Super Reverb for that kind of sweet edge of breakup tone. In my opinion, the Super Reverb tone is not fully cranked, which we're going to talk about more in a few minutes. It's that edge of breakup, bluesy, it's starting to fill out, it's starting to really kind of clip if you dig in, but it also stays sultry and clean if you back off. That's like the classic Super Reverb tone, and then especially works well if you boost that with a pedal, which we're also going to do in a few minutes. Do you see how I'm connecting? I think about stuff. So having the output power selector gives you the ability to achieve that tone at a lower volume. That's really one of the primary purposes of this amplifier. Now, it also has a balanced XLR line out with two optional cab simulators, which are IR based. There's one for an SM57 and one for a ribbon mic. So you can use that for plugging directly into a PA, direct in recording, to make it even that much more versatile. And now we're going to get to the other point about what makes this special, what makes this different. The other major complaint about the Super Reverb is that it is a backbreaker. It's actually not as heavy as you'd expect. According to Sweetwater, it's 65 pounds. But 65 pounds is, I don't want to be lugging around 65 pounds all the time. And that is a detriment. It is something that, for instance, if I'm looking at a gig, if I'm going to take out the Super versus the Princeton, it's kind of a no-brainer. The Princeton's a lot easier to grab, still gets a great tone. I'm not sacrificing tone with the Princeton, obviously. The Super, I've really only taken out on special occasions. It's just been one of those things. It's like, hey, if this is a big gig, if this is an important gig and I'm really craving that super tone, yeah, I'll lug it out. The rest of the time it sits here. I use it a lot, of course, because I play a lot here. I record a lot and I do videos and whatnot, but it stays at home. The Tone Master is 36 pounds. So that's just slightly above half the weight of this behemoth sitting next to me. To put things into perspective, Sweetwater has the Princeton listed at 34 pounds. So that's 2 pounds heavier than a Princeton Reverb. The Tone Master Super Reverb is 2 pounds heavier than a Princeton Reverb. It is so easy to carry. So the big question on a lot of people's mind is, does it deliver tonally? So we're going to listen to some tones so you can hear what we're talking about, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about what I think about this at the end. So let's get back in with some tones here. Now, the first thing that I want to do is go over the reverb and the tremolo. I have often said, many of you may have heard me say this at some point or another, that the Super Reverb is the reverb amp that all other reverbs need to live up to. It's just one of the best reverbs ever. So let's play it now. We're going to turn the reverb all the way up with a Gretsch 6120, and then I'm going to go back with a Telecaster and play on a tremolo tone, a heavier tremolo sound. So let's dive in with some tone here using the effects. Now those clips were recorded on 45 watts, so I was using it basically like I would use a regular super reverb. Now I'm going to use the output power selector, and I'm going to duck it down to 5 watts, and I'm going to turn the volume up more. I'm not going to crank the reverb, but I'm going to give it a hefty amount of reverb, a generous amount of reverb. You know, there's this rule in the studio, find the spot where the reverb sounds good and then back it off a hair, and that's where your reverb should be. I kind of go the opposite direction. I find where the reverb sounds good and then I turn it up a hair. That's just how I like to work. Anyway, we're going to try it out now. This is kind of going for a bluesy tone where it's not getting to a point where it's clipping, but the sound is a little richer and more full. I've got the volume turned up more. Again, not to the point where it's breaking up, but to the point where you're starting to get that slight bit of sag to it, a little bit more oomph behind the note, and then adding in a bit, maybe a slightly too much reverb on top of that so that you can hear what it sounds like for just a really powerful but still sultry and expressive blues reverb tone. Now I mentioned pedals. Let's try it out with a pedal. Now what I'm going to do for this clip is, again, I'm going to use it on the 5-watt selection. And the reason for that is because one of the ideas behind this amp, again, being that you get to that sweet spot, is that that's where pedals work best with it. One of the tricky things with a super reverb, a tube super reverb, is that if you don't get it to that sweet spot, sometimes pedals don't interact with it very well. I'm not saying pedals don't sound good into it, but sometimes you might need to dial them in a little different, a little less gain, a little less tone, because they can come across as a little bit grainy and brash. You have more free range if you get it to the point where it's at that sweet spot, but that sweet spot's really loud. So I'm going to have it here on that 5-watt setting again. I'm going to push it up to a point where it's more at a sweet spot. Now, it's still clean, but it's pushed a lot harder than you'd be able to regularly push a super reverb. And then hit it with an Ibanez TS808, classic TS808, really, you know, one of the best tone combinations you can get out there is a super reverb with a TS808. So let's listen to how that sounds now. All right, now we're going to try out the amp's clipping. Now you do this with the volume knob, so I am going to use the output power selector on this a lot because I don't particularly fancy sitting here and just diming it. I've done it with this one. I don't do it that often. It's unpleasant. It's just really, really loud. So I'm going to start out with the Stratocaster on the 1/2-watt setting. This is going to be pretty low in volume, but you'll hear it still sounds very, very rich. So we're going to listen to that. Then we're going to listen to the Gretsch going into the normal channel with the bright switch activated. So that's a little bit different, and that one does not have the reverb and the tremolo. And also try it out with the Telecaster in the vibrato channel turned all the way up. So a whole kind of range of different drive sounds that you can get. Now the Gretsch Gretsch and the Telecaster recorded at the 1 watt setting, which actually being in the room with is pretty loud. It's certainly not too loud for a gig application or a recording application, but when it's just me in the room, it's pretty loud. So we're going to listen to all these different drive tones, and then I'm going to tell you what I think about this amp and whether or not it's something I would recommend. Now, I do want to mention before I get into my personal opinion on it that this is a sponsored review. This is something I'm collaborating with Fender on. However, I am going to give you my honest thoughts about it. It is a good quality piece of gear, so keep that in mind. All right, so my thoughts on this amplifier. Is it exact? Probably not. But it's really, really close. And it's close enough that I think in any kind of real-world practical musical application, you won't notice the difference. And I can say that definitively because I've already had the opportunity to play this amp live. And when I was playing it live, I did not notice the difference at all. It responded like a super reverb. You know, the dynamics were like a super reverb. The depth of tone was like a super reverb. Now, one of the things that I found tricky about doing this review is I did find myself sort of overly scrutinizing. Does it sound digital? Well, what if I do it this way? Does it sound digital? Well, what if I do it this way? It's almost like I wanted to find it sounding digital. I didn't want to find it sounding digital. I wanted to find it sounding natural. But then you start to get into, just like, well, if I have that, then why do I have this? But I love this amp. I'd be heartbroken if I had to get rid of this amp, my regular Tube Super. The thing is it is very practical, and any two amps aren't going to sound exactly alike anyway. Some of the differences, for instance, like, you turn the super reverb on. When you get the tubes warmed up and you flip on the standby, there's that kind of like, there's like this glow. It's not quite a hum, but there's almost like, you almost sense the power emanating, an elegant weapon from a more civilized age. It's that kind of, there's something that you sort of feel the power of the amplifier as it you know, as So of course this one doesn't have that because it is a digital amp. When you click it on, it's not really that much that happens until you hit a chord. Now, a couple of major benefits, as we already talked about, the weight is just an absolute huge one. You can take it out without feeling like it's bolted to the floor when you go to lift it up. So that's a big one. No tube maintenance, that's another big one. It has a USB out where you can update the firmware if you need to update the firmware. And of course the output power selector. Now, one of the things that I really liked is when I performed with it live, I performed with it on 12 watts, or 12 watt, the 12 watt setting, you know. When I got to that point, I could turn the volume up louder, getting it more to the sweet spot. Again, still totally clean, but getting to a point where the overdrive pedal jumped off of it a little bit better. It sunk in a little bit better. And for that, when I played live, I used a TS9, and I got some great overdriven tones with the TS9 and that on 12 watts. I will say that it takes pedals slightly differently, but that's, again, that's kind of, it's a little bit tricky because when you get this regular super reverb to that point of volume is overwhelming when you're near it. This one, running it at a lower volume and being able to get that same kind of richer tone, I don't know that you can compare them exactly. The only way to compare them exactly would be to run the Tone Master at the 45 watt setting. Just basically do it the same, but then that kind of defeats the whole purpose. Now, overdriving it all the way is something that I'm not crazy about. It has a pretty bright and aggressive top end clipping to it that is not something, again, it's not 100% for me. However, like I mentioned, that's not really the super reverb sound to me. I actually find the same with this one. And again, I have dimed it before. I don't do it that often. But one of the reasons I don't do it is because it's just got an aggressive top end when you really crank it. That is not something I want to use. And again, I don't necessarily think that's the classic super reverb tone either. The classic super reverb tone is in the middle. It's that pushed one, and then if you really want to get it rip-roaring, you hit it with a pedal. So for any criticism that I would have of the heavy drive, of turning it all the way up, that's a criticism kind of the super reverb in general, as opposed to the Tone Master version. Now, dynamically, it did sound a little bit different, I thought, at least on different power output selectors. Of course it does, because it's pushing different amounts of air, and everything sounds a little bit different at different volumes. So that's something that you can experiment with, that you can try out a lot of different tones with. But I think really the key to this amp and getting the most out of this amp is using it in one of those mid-level power selectors, getting it to that kind of sweet spot. That's where the tone of this amp is. That's the selling feature of this amp. And the other thing is that it is also $11.99 new, whereas the Super Reverb 65 reissue is $18.99 new. So you're not talking an insignificant dollar difference there. That's a pretty significant difference in price. Now, I'm not saying don't get the big super. I love this amp. Again, I would never want to get rid of this amp unless I was in a situation where I absolutely had to. If you're somebody who really just absolutely loves the real tube and everything about it, that kind of, again, that power, the, you know, feeling the force flowing through you when you hit the standby switch on, there is still something about a tube amp in general that there is a little bit slightly more of this 3D quality, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the notes or the tone. It has to do with the feeling of it, and that would be the one place where the Tone Master is not exact. Again, it's as close as I could ever hope a digital recreation to be. So that's what I think about this, but please let us know what you think. Are you a Tone Master player? Do you have one of the deluxe reverbs, the twin reverbs, or do you have one of the super? They're just coming out this month. It's August of 2021. Let us know if you have any of these Tone Masters, if you've used them, what has been your experience. Feel free to share in the comments. I'm Jack Fossett. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.